Well, hello everyone, wherever you're logging in from, and whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening for you. I'm David Peters-Corbett. I'm director of the Courtauld Centre for American Art, and I'm going to introduce the In Conversation event today. To mark the Barbican's forthcoming exhibition, Jean Dubuffet, Brutal Beauty, the first on the artist in the UK for over 50 years, the Courtauld Research Forum and the Centre for American Art are hosting a conversation between acclaimed art historian Hal Foster and leading Dubuffet scholar Kent Minturn, based on Hal Foster's 2020 monograph, Brutal Aesthetics, Dubuffet, Bataille, Jorn, Paolozzi, Oldenburg, which appeared from Princeton University Press. I'm sure you'll be keen to know about the exhibition. I'm told the Barbican are hoping to open it in May, pending, naturally, government guidelines and direction. And we have the show's curator, Eleanor Nairn, with us today. But let me introduce the two speakers now. Hal Foster is the author of numerous books, including most recently, What Comes After Farce, Art and Criticism at a Time of Debacle, Verso, 2020, and Brutal Aesthetics, Princeton University Press, 2020 as well, which formed his 2018 Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery in Washington. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he teaches at Princeton, co-edits the journal October, and contributes regularly to the London Review of Books and Art Forum. Kent Minturn is a New York-based art historian and critic, currently teaching for Columbia University's Art Humanities program. He's published widely on art brut and Jean Dubuffet, including a recent essay in October on the artist's relationship with the late French philosopher Hubert Demiche. In the spring of 2019, Kent Minturn led a seminar on modernism's reception of the art of the insane at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. So I'll just very quickly say something about how the shape of the hour will unfold. In a moment, I'm going to turn to Hal Foster to give an introduction to the book. And then after Hal has spoken, we'll go to Kent Minturn, who will launch the conversation with some questions and responses. Finally, and presuming we have time, we'll give audience members a chance to ask questions too. So if you do have a question that arises during the course of the presentations, please put them in the chat and we'll see them. I should say that we may very well not be able to get to everybody. And so apologies in advance if that's the case and if you're not called on. If we get to the Q&A, I'll call on people and I'll ask you to tune in briefly and repeat the question. So that's how it's going to work out. But I'm delighted now to pass over to Hal Foster. Hal.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Eleanor, for the wonderful catalog, and I'm sure the wonderful show to come. And thanks to Kent for being here, and everyone else for looking in. I do have a few things to say about this book, and maybe I'll just share my screen now. Does that look okay?
Looks great, thank you.
Okay, about this book. Well, modernism teaches us how to survive civilization, Walter Benjamin wrote enigmatically in the early 1930s. It had to teach us, and we had to learn, Benjamin thought, because the humanist tradition had failed to prevent both the devastation of World War and the violence of fascist politics. Civilization had thus become barbaric in its own right. To this perverse turn in history, Benjamin answered with a dialectical twist of thought. Modernism teaches us how to survive a barbaric civilization through a positive barbarism of its own, one that aims to be equal to the new poverty of experience at large. Among other idiosyncratic examples, he mentions the schematic figures of Paul Claes and the stark facades of Adolf Loos. What does poverty of experience do for the barbarian, Benjamin asks? It forces him to start from scratch, to make a new start, to make a little go a long way. Like everyone else, Benjamin thought the worst had come with World War I, with what he called the tiny, fragile human body caught in a force field of destructive torrents and explosions. But in fact, the worst didn't arrive until the mass deaths of World War II, the Holocaust, and the bomb. Only then was one truly forced to start from scratch, to make a new start, to make a little go a long way. In these circumstances, what ground could artists and writers claim? What means adequate to the destruction all around them? What but the most basic, the most brutal? In this book, I'm interested in the pervasive turn from the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s to the brute and the brutalist, the animal and the creaturely, as these are manifest in the early work of Jean Dubuffet, Georges Bataille, Asger Jorn, Eduardo Paolozzi, and Claes Oldenburg. Each of these figures proposes a different version of brutal aesthetics, one that strips art down or reveals it to be already bare in order to begin again. But to what ends exactly? Why does Dubuffet invent the notion of art brut, or raw art? What does Bataille seek in the prehistoric cave paintings of France? Why does Jorn populate his cobra paintings with creaturely figures? What does Paolozzi see in his monsters assembled from industrial debris? And why does Oldenburg remake cheap products from urban scrap? To begin again is almost a contradiction in terms. These figures want a clean slate, only to find an overwritten one. They seek foundations, only to find that they are equivocal. Like Robinson Crusoe, whom Dubuffet and Oldenburg adopted as a persona, each washes up on an island of his own devising, only to discover that it too is treacherous terrain. Among the tricky questions I encountered are these. How could Dubuffet imagine an art that is unscathed by culture? What did Bataille hope to unlock in the enigma of a first man depicted as a beast? Why did Jorn figure political crisis in the form of human animals? How did Paolozzi pick out a path to survival through the ruins around him? And finally, why did Oldenburg stake his hope for metamorphosis in junk? Some of my figures, such as Dubuffet and Oldenburg, are well known. Others, such as Jorn and Paolozzi, are less so, at least in the United States. In each case, though, I focus on early work and highlight aspects that are less familiar. For instance, I take up Bataille, the post-war prehistorian, not the pre-war dissident surrealist. In doing so, I aim to reposition, maybe to revalue these artists. At the same time, I don't apologize for the ways that they, all white, straight men, are marked by the racism and sexism of their time. I do have soft spots for Jorn and Oldenburg in particular. In any case, the avant-garde that concerns me here is not very heroic. It doesn't usually pretend that it can break absolutely with the old order or found a new one. Rather, it often seeks to trace fractures that already exist within the given order, to pressure them further, even to activate them somehow. And maybe there's a resonance here with some contemporary practice. Let me mention just a few themes in the book. First, Dubuffet and the whole concern with art brut. His first avatars, Kent knows better than I, for the art brut is the art of children. And he, as with other avatars, adopts, assimilates, then rejects. He finds the art of children finally to dictionary, by which he means that somehow, rather than a form of expression outside of culture, it's a coded language of given signs, automatic signs of its own. He finds a similar problem with his second version of art brut, the art of the so-called common man. And he sees graffiti first somehow as anti-cultural, but then quickly discovers that it too is scripted. And this is true even of the art of the insane, to which he turns next. Now, another concern, and this speaks to art brut directly, another concern of the book is the riddle of origins, of the origins of the human, the sexual, the familial, but also of representation, also of art. This is clear enough in this Dubuffet, but it's there first and foremost in Bataille. His Lascaux book is really investigation in the riddles of origins of the human and the artistic. But the difference is, I think, with Bataille is that he really treats origin as enigma, not as source. But even so, like Bataille, like Dubuffet, Bataille is caught up in double binds to the same extent that Dubuffet acculturates what he projects as outside culture, the child, the common man, the insane. There's a way in which, for all his interest in the transgressive enigma at the birth of the human, he can't get out of this loop whereby transgression reinscribes law. So a concern with origins runs through the book. There's also, and this was a bit of a surprise to me, a concern with sovereignty. This is a topic I didn't expect to come to the fore, although it's clearly a major concern of Bataille after World War II. And it speaks to a general crisis in political authority after the war. But Paolozzi takes this up, I think, directly, as he, in the context of the independent group, wonders how artistic culture can somehow compete to form new archetypes, compete with mass culture, perhaps to devise new myths. I'm also, and this is obviously very schematic, I'm also very interested in the book in shifts in models of practice, in figures of the artist. So there is a turn away from the modernist type of the constructor, of the engineer, toward the figure of the scavenger, the bricoleur. And this idea of bricolage, obviously it comes from Lévi-Strauss, but it comes to Lévi-Strauss in the context of art brut. He was a close observer of the development of art brut chez Dubuffet. Another shift that is important to me in the book is a shift from the figure of the animal in modernist art. It's a figure of pure vision. And Mark has this beautiful line about what it is to imagine nature as a deer might see it. But in my group of artists, the animal is distorted into the creaturely, and it signals not pure vision, but a denatured condition. Finally, one of the avatars of positive barbarism for Benjamin is the early Mickey Mouse. He says, again, enigmatically a few times, without any explanation, that Mickey teaches us how to survive civilization. And he has in mind early films like Steamboat Willie, where nothing can kill Mickey. And somehow the entire animal world, the entire object world is metamorphosed into new forms of life beyond death and destruction. And I think this is the Mickey, this is the Disney that Oldenburg also takes up. Oldenburg concerned to transform everything, to transform object relations as we know them again and again. You see this in this fabulous little drawing, which an ice cream cone becomes a mouse mouse becomes a hill. His gun, his ray gun, is transformed again and again. But that fight, that struggle with reification, with the desire to imagine a different relation to the world, that I think also hardens in the end. And so the book ends rather grimly. I really want to get to Ken and to your questions, but let me just mention a couple of other themes quite quickly. All my artists are concerned with brut materiality. With medium impurity, I think this is clear enough in this desire to undo figure ground oppositions as the basis of representation, but they never go abstract. And I'm interested in how figuration is turned into disfiguration by this group. Psychologically, that means an interest in desublimation, an interest in regression. Dubuffet was called a cacaïste. Oldenburg was happy to be known as a shit artist, and Paolozzi talks about his mud language. In the same way, they all see representation as somehow violent, even as they also want it to be transformative. They're ambivalent too about language. They're extraordinary writers to a person, but they mangle language. And some are concerned to ex-nominate art. Dubuffet says again and again that art brut is art that doesn't know its name. And for me, this suggests that they inhabit a line outside the dominant Duchampian lines. I mean, if Duchamp nominated objects as art, in a way, figures like Dubuffet and Jorn, Paolozzi, and Oldenburg, I think, want to ex-nominate, to imagine not only new terms for art, but to imagine art that exceeds language. Obviously enough, they're hostile to the classical tradition. Bataille seeks an origin that undercuts the origin of antiquity. Jorn loves to be known as the Nordic vandal who has come to sack Europe. And they're also ambivalent about the humanist tradition, but they're not anti-humanist. I think they're different from the generation of anti-humanists who follow them, especially in France. Vis-a-vis history, I think they feel stuck. Dialectical thinking becomes difficult for them. They remain extremely critical, but critique is a matter of subversion, not negation. They want to undercut rather than go beyond, or at least they're stuck in that position. Maybe they do want to go beyond, but they can't. In the same way, I think they're somewhere between the foundationalism of so many modernists and the deconstruction, again, of many artists and theorists that follow them. Politically, they're often quite problematic, perhaps Dubuffet and Bataille most of all. I think they fall into that non-category that Sternhell has given us, neither right nor left, with the exception of Jorn, who is a Marxist first and last. He obviously becomes a situationist too. But politically, they're also constrained. Yeah, I mean, I have a soft spot for Oldenburg too, as well as Jorn, and he's very involved in the Marxo-Freudianism of the 1960s. He really runs with Norman O'Brown, for example. But do they have a political project? I mean, Bataille does, problematic one, to be sure. But I don't see any of them as proto-fascists or, and one note that I want to underscore is a note that Bataille adds in a letter to Alexander Kojève, the great reader of Hegel for the generation of Bataille. Bataille writes of his unemployed negativity. And I think that might be a term that can apply for some of the others as well. Maybe I'll leave it there for now and ditch the screen. And Ken, are you there, or have you left me for good or bad?
Hi, sorry. I just received a note on my computer that my internet was unstable. So Hal, I didn't hear what you said in the last 30 seconds, but have you stopped speaking? Okay, sorry about that. Surprise, given that our conversation coincides with Eleanor's incredible and extremely comprehensive Dubuffet show at the Barbican, I wanted to stay with Dubuffet for a while. He is the subject of your first chapter. He is the artist who chronologically comes first. But I think in many ways he sets the stage for the rest of your book. And I just wanted to ask, why was it so essential for you to start with him and to, pick up Dubuffet again as a subject? I remember reading your essay that you wrote for the Drawing Center on Dubuffet and his relation to the art of the insane. But in many ways, I think Dubuffet seems more relevant than ever at this point. So maybe, more on Dubuffet, please.
Sure, although I'm a bit embarrassed to talk about Dubuffet in front of you and Eleanor and others here who are much more Dubuffet experts than I think, for me, this need to find a new or other ground after the war is most explicit in Dubuffet. That's why I really wanted to begin with him. It's really his game, tabula rasa. And I think part of him knows that it is a game. And part of him knows that he rigs the game, even though he fails at it again and again. In other words, his different versions of art brut, as I mentioned, never quite stick for him. And that search for this brutal ground and the way in which it sank away underneath him, again, a la Robinson Crusoe on the beach, that really interested me. But I would love to hear you, Ken, or Eleanor too, on why Dubuffet has come back now. I mean, I have to say for me, or maybe people of my generation, the late Dubuffet was around us and in the 1970s and 1980s, and he was even though he never wanted to be, quite an institutional figure. And then in the 1990s, there was, in part, an October project to think the inform, the formless, and Yves Bois and Rosalind Krauss treated Dubuffet a bit as a bad object, that he wasn't really formless, that his interest in brute materiality was really to see the emergence of form, the emergence of the figure. So I come to Dubuffet with, two marks against him, and that's why I'm interested that he would attract me lately. But this is just an old guy on Dubuffet. I'm interested to know why you all are interested.
Okay, sorry, my internet just failed. Hal, I can hear you now again.
Kent, we lost you for a minute,
Yeah,
but it's
sorry.
fine because we're going to be seamless. Because Hal was actually asking about why would anyone be interested in Dubuffet right now?
I didn't put it negatively. No, I think there is interest.
He said it in a nicer way.
No, there is real interest. There's your show, but Kent was also involved in a show in New York a couple of years ago. It's very active. I mean, I'm part of the Dubuffet camp too. I'm interested to know why you think he's become of interest again, important again.
So I could say a few words from me, and then Kent can catch his breath and make sure his internet is stabilized, because that is a horrible feeling when you're on a public talk.
I'm back.
But I think, my answer to that question in a way was twofold. One was when I was doing the Basquiat show, which we staged at the Barbican in 2017, and I was really kind of curious about, Basquiat is of course somebody who has voracious cultural interests and draws from all sorts of different sources, but Dubuffet is a really major influence for him. And he considers him, not just formally, but I think he sees in him another artist who doesn't have a formal training. Dubuffet has 6 months at the Académie Julian and decides that he can do better himself. Is also somebody who is inspired by graffiti and really interested in a kind of language of the street and what that means. So I was kind of curious about how Dubuffet had somehow managed to be shocking and interesting to figures ranging from Antonin Artaud to Clement Greenberg to Dubuffet, to Basquiat and Keith Haring, up to contemporary artists working today. And the other context, of course, for us, for those on the talk who know the Barbican, we are a brutalist art center. And there's something about that architecture. Dubuffet was very present in the first show that was curated at the Barbican when it opened in 1982, which Sarah Wilson from the Courtauld was very involved in organizing. And so he was there right from the beginning. He also has a story, his story, this from the 1940s to the 1980s mirrors the story of the Barbican's building from the 40s to the 80s. Brutalism itself, of course, new brutalism connects to the independent group. So there are these very kind of intertwined histories, and it seemed to me a really kind of interesting moment to present him and think about what he has meant to artistic practice and what he continues to mean to artistic practice. But Kent has a much more long-standing engagement with Dubuffet, and he will probably have some other thoughts on why he might suddenly feel relevant to us again now.
I think your answer was well stated. I would just add that Dubuffet was extremely prolific, and he was very much a polymath. He did a wide range of things, worked in a wide range of media, did experimental poetry, did stage design, architecture. He was a painter as well. He made sculpture. So I think that artists working today often find one aspect of his oeuvre or his career that they can really relate to, and it's still relevant. And I also think that, his theorization of art brut, his interest in art brut, continues to this day. In many ways, I think art brut, defined as such, begins and ends with Dubuffet, but the continuation of that in the form of our interest in outsider art is very relevant today, and it's what a lot of working artists can relate to, in the sense that it's art produced outside of the academy, and was for a long time outside of the museum. And I think this moment, the kind of conflation or the coalescence of art brut, outsider art, and contemporary art is something that, you know, keeps people talking about Dubuffet and thinking about his pioneering interest in this work that falls outside of history, or falls outside of the academy, or outside of the museum. I think things are changing now. We have outsider artists that are entering the museum. We have shows like Lynn Cook's Outliers, incredible exhibition that was in DC. So the reverence that Dubuffet had for this kind of art is now, I think, more mainstream. I think it's thought of in a more serious way, and it's entered into museums and into the marketplace. And you know, whenever you are talking about outsider art, you have to start with Dubuffet, and it continues to this day, I think.
May I suggest another connection to contemporary concerns? I mean, Dubuffet liked to think, and this is maybe part of the supreme fiction of art brut, that art brut was not concerned about audience, that the vision was so driven that the spectator was almost null. And I think after years and years of attention to the viewer, you know, from the creative act of Duchamp, you know, the share of the beholder, to this concern with relational aesthetics, there's a bit of a fatigue with that, that obsession with relationality, with participation, and the idea that there might be an art directed somewhere else has enormous appeal. But that's just a speculation.
It still has enormous appeal, I think. And I think, Eleanor, it's so great that you've included examples of art brut in the show. It was a kind of parallel universe for Dubuffet, but it paralleled his own career as an artist. And, you know, even in the immediate post-war period is when he took an interest in it, but it went on through the publications of the Cahiers de l'Art Brut in the 60s as well, which I think was incredibly influential, not just for the art world, but philosophy, and you know, it shows up in, or thoughts about art brut show up in Deleuze's writings, etc. So yeah, I think it's still relevant.
On the note as well, to link up some of the artists in Hal's book, one of the things that first really drew me, I mean, as an exhibition maker, you're also really a storyteller, and you're kind of being drawn in by stories that you feel aren't quite being told. And the story that I never really understood about Dubuffet was that he always seemed to me a story of two halves. Okay, so there is the kind of Prince Charming who Hal showed in his slides, this disfigured figure, and that very kind of brutal, mucky, materialist Dubuffet, which we know. And then there is this very other kind of, I guess it speaks of my generation, that what I thought of as this kind of proto-Keith Haring Dubuffet, of reds and whites and blues, the Lawloop period. How do they connect? And are these the same artist? And if so, what happened in between? And it's not a full account of the story, but one part of that story is about the collection of art brut, which he sends off to Alfonso Osorio in 1951. He's kind of had enough and can't really, you know, feels that it's eclipsing his own artistic practice. And Osorio says he will house it at his mansion in the Creeks. So off it goes to Long Island, 1,200 objects shipped across the Atlantic with all of his research, his metal filing cabinets.
Mhm.
And it ends up being there for 10 years. And I kind of both couldn't really wrap my head around that bit, which I became aware of when I was working on the Lee Krasner show, because Krasner and Pollock were, of course, great friends of Osorio's, and became aware that artists like Oldenburg had made special visits to be able to go and see the collection while it was housed with Osorio. But then it comes back to Dubuffet, and it comes back because he pleads for it to be returned to him. He sends these letters saying losing a piece is a pain like losing an eye, and he can't live with these works without these works any longer. And he rehangs the collection. And back to Hal's point about that idea of perhaps a slightly mythic or romantic image of an artist working purely from their own impulses, he's surrounded by this work again in the Rue de Sèvres, and he says, I need to make my own parallel universe. And that is where L'Orloup is born, is completely from that. And of course, he makes that work for 12 years, and it's the longest single body of work that he makes. So that becomes a very simple part of the exhibition, to say, well, we should have a room of art brut that looks at what he is hanging in 1962, and then you can encounter L'Orloup, and then maybe you'll have some sense of where this parallel universe comes from. So no, we've been very glad to be able to include about 50 works from the Collection de l'Art Brut in Lausanne.
Excellent. Can we go back to your book, Hal? Because I'm not sure
where. About Dubuffet, more about me. Sure. Yeah.
I think I'm not sure where we cut out, and I apologize for that. But after your first chapter on Dubuffet, your next figure is Bataille and his interest in Lascaux, and I found that extremely enlightening to put those two thinkers next to each other. Although less so than the other figures you look at, I don't think Dubuffet was a big influence on Bataille. They probably knew each other, met in the 20s. But as far as I know, no correspondence exists between the two. Yet at the same time, there seems to be some affinities there, which you tease out. And there seems to be certain double binds, as you call them, as far as Dubuffet wanting to talk about art brut as something outside of culture, and then ultimately he wants to enculturate these artists. And Bataille, you write, he thrills to transgression only then to acknowledge that it serves to reinscribe the law. And I was just fascinated with putting those two thinkers next to each other, and also thinking about how Dubuffet was inspired by art brut, and he theorized art brut, even though he didn't create it. He was in awe of art brut. And I think Bataille was in awe of the paintings he saw in Lascaux. And I enjoyed seeing the two figures, Bataille following Dubuffet in your book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue that Dubuffet did create art brut, and you could argue that Bataille imagined a whole other Lascaux. I mean, the art brut artists didn't think much of what Dubuffet had to say, and I don't think prehistorians really took on the Lascaux book too seriously, but they are both interested in limit concepts. I mean, I don't know if it's a term that that Dubuffet would know, or indeed Bataille, but they push their own thought to the point where it can't go any further. And with Dubuffet, it breaks down around iterations of what could be really, truly brut. With Bataille, it's a little bit different. I mean, he, finally, Dubuffet will say that art brut is equivocal. This is towards the end of his critical reflections. This becomes an important term for him. Bataille begins with the equivocal. For him, the caves are enigmatic. So even as he seeks origins, he understands that the origins will only produce more enigmas. So he's not quite as stuck in his own double bind as Dubuffet is in his. But there is this this slam dance between transgression and law in Bataille that he never quite exceeds. But he actually poses the human as an equivocal project. And so it doesn't trip him up in the same way. But the others, I think, in a way, just assume that equivocal nature of art, representation, the human, the sexual, and so on, and they go from there. That's why, they're paired together at the beginning of the book, and the others follow. And as Eleanor suggested, Jorn did know Dubuffet and did read a bit of Bataille. Paolozzi and Oldenburg were also very taken by the art brut collection, as Eleanor mentioned. So there are these lines that run through.
Absolutely. I have more questions, but David, I'm not sure if I should continue or we should open up the floor to questions from the attendees today.
Thanks, Kent, and thanks for that heroic moment when you dealt with your technical problem there. So
that's our Zoom universe. We have to deal with this.
What I'd suggest actually is if you have another question for Hal, this might be a good moment to answer it, and then after that we might come to the audience for the last 10 minutes or so.
Okay, I do have more questions for Hal. Thanks. So I wanted to ask you about the fact that this is your latest book is part 2 of a 3-part trilogy or project on the avant-garde at times of emergency. And in your next project, I think I'm right,
you tell me.
We'll focus on the 1920s and the historical avant-garde. I was just wondering, do your ideas and your kind of thesis of positive barbarism borrowed from Benjamin, does that exist in artistic practice before the post-World War II period in the 20s and the 30s? And does it continue to exist today in contemporary practice?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a good one, for me anyway. Certainly Benjamin thought that it did exist. I mean, he writes about positive barbarism in the early 1930s, and the context is clear, but he doesn't really develop the concept. I mean, it would refer people to the extraordinary text, quite short text called Experience in Poverty. But he just guesses at the term. That's why I think it's actually more appropriate. It's developed in practice later. He anticipates it in a way. But for me, this project about the avant-garde at times of emergency really does come out of the long present. I mean, this present seems endless, but I mean, since 9/11, when this country and others too were placed in a intermittent state of emergency with Bush and indeed with Obama and certainly with Trump, and it's not the United States alone. And this called out people like me, and I'm certainly not alone here. And there's a massive turn of interest in figures like Carl Schmitt, who really fought emergency in the 1920s and 1930s, and fought the question of sovereignty and the the whole project of Giorgio Agamben follows from this. And the Agambinian project is very much a theoretical one in relation to the crisis of this long present. And that's how I see my project too. It's really driven by my own experience, our own experience over the last 20 years, uneven as that is. And it led me to think about the avant-garde in different ways. I mean, I was given an avant-garde that either was transgressive, a la Dada and Surrealism, or legislative, a la constructivism. In other words, it wanted to trash an order that was given or to build a new one. But what do you do, as Hugo Ball says in his diary, in the midst of World War I, when there are no laws anymore, when laws are suspended, which is the definition of emergency? And that much more, to use the Dubuffetian term, equivocal situation, for me was a way to relocate the avant-gardes that interested me, and to think again about how they might connect or disconnect across the centuries. So, my work as a critic is focused on the present largely, and my two recent Verso books, Bad New Days and What Comes After Farce, are very much written towards practices and theories in our own time of emergency. So that's in a way part three. Part two is really brutal aesthetics, this predicament after World War II. But in the first part, and I've gone in reverse chronological orders, is to think about modernisms in the wake of nihilism and anarchism in the late 19th century, after Nietzsche, after Bakunin, to think about, say, the anarcho-syndicalism of Georges Sorel, who influenced not only the futurists, but also the vorticists. I mean, T.E. Hume translated Sorel. What's that about? To think about the very close dialogue that Hugo Ball had with Carl Schmitt. I mean, Schmitt thought that Ball was his smartest interlocutor. How does Ball go from a dissertation on Nietzsche and a book project on Bakunin to Schmitt? And then I also want to think about the left-wing communism of Berlin Dada. I want to think about the left-wing melancholy of Neue Sachlichkeit. But I don't know exactly what the first part of this project will bear, if anything. To be honest, there's a part of me that just wants to get out, as they say. Get out of my own project, get out of this state of emergency.
Yes, I think we all want to get out of the state of emergency, but we look forward to your next project, which is the third part of this trilogy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you,
David.
Can I now turn to questions from the audience, which are now beginning to flow in? And I'm sorry, again, I must say, we're not going to get to everybody. And also, actually, to speed things up, rather than turning to you, as I said I would do, I'm going to read stuff out. So bear with me while I do that, and I'll have to be selective. So there's a question from Colin Rhodes, actually, which is quite a pointed one. He writes, Dubuffet, Bataille and Jorn came of age before the Second World War, while Oldenburg and Paolozzi are really post-war arrivals. Do you see a difference between the ways in which those two groups are dealing with the ideas that you've been discussing?
Yeah, it is a great question, and for me, they are somehow intergenerational. I don't see a huge divide. Paolozzi attended fascist camp as a kid in Italy. His father and grandfather were in a transport ship that was torpedoed And I mean, the war was very much in his life. But to the extent that he was part of the independent group, yes, of course, he deals with the post-war condition. Oldenburg is also strangely intergenerational. Too often he's elided with pop, and for me he's as much brutalist as pop. And for me, Oldenburg is a way to look back to a different genealogy. I think I mentioned this in relation to Duchamp, that might foreground all more than Duchamp, and that might foreground Oldenburg more than Warhol. I mean, this is strange for me to say, given that I'm an Octoberite, and you have to swear to Duchamp and Warhol. And not that we need another paternal lineage, but for me, the fact that Jorn and Oldenburg are connected and disconnected, and Paolozzi too, to these other figures, allowed me to suggest that there might be kind of a broken history there that could be explored, if that makes any sense. But it's a good question I need to think more about.
Thank you. I've got another question. This is from Shorakate Kazarian. And it's about how Dubuffet's idea of art brut has evolved in the 70s in concert with Roger Cardinal's concept of outsider art. Although it was initially seen as an American version of the art brut, outsider art encompassed larger categories. What was Dubuffet's opinion about this outsider art concept? Did it change his definition of art brut?
Well, here maybe I can use my lifelines, Eleanor and Kent, and have them respond, because I'm sure they have much more to say about this subject than I. Take it away.
Eleanor?
So Dubuffet was very fond of the fact that he had really coined art brut as a phrase. So he wasn't quickly about to adopt anybody else's language in lieu of his own. A fact that my colleague Charlotte recently discovered, which I thought was fascinating, I hadn't come across this, was that Roger Cardinal didn't himself want to use outsider art as a phrase, but he got into an argument with his publisher in the 70s because the publisher said, you're never going to sell a book about art brut because nobody's going to understand what it is. So you need a more accessible term. So reluctantly, he agreed to outsider art. And the poor man has ever since been besieged by arguments about who gets to define what an inside or an outside is. And actually, it was never the terminology that he wanted to use to begin with. We in the show use art brut throughout, mostly because Dubuffet was a wine merchant, and I always think that he liked the fact that this work was as brut as dry champagne, that it was intended to be a pun. It was meant to be to say that this was à l'état brut. It was in its natural, raw, unrefined state, but it was also, one of the finest things a person could encounter. So that's the language we've used. There is a much longer answer to give about the kind of orthodoxies around art brut, and Hal has been written, I think, brilliantly about the ways in which Dubuffet ties himself up in knots about these things. And the best example is probably Gaston Chessac, who he has this very protracted and very argumentative relationship with. And in the 60s, when Chessac is attracting quite a lot of attention, he simply annexes him to a different part of the art brut collection of people who are actually a little bit, less marginalized than others. So, there are some really questionable gestures that were going on. And like many collectors, Dubuffet made a fetish out of how he thought about his own museum. And he was constantly redefining his own taxonomies. So we have done our best to take his language and his spirit of championing these artists, but to also be transparent about the aspects of the practice that we agree with less.
I would thank you, Eleanor, for that. I would just add that I think in '72, when Roger Cardinal published his book on outsider art, I think Dubuffet was in the mindset that he wanted to kind of relieve himself of some of the duties of his art brut collection. And so he's talking to Michel Thévaux, who will become the first director of the collection of art brut in Lausanne. And the interesting thing about the Roger Cardinal book is that Dubuffet has to write the foreword or the preface. And it's almost this handing of the torch and him giving his blessing, but also having the first word and the last word on art brut, you know, still kind of keeping it in his domain. But what you said about Dubuffet's play on the word brut, I think he was very much conscious of that. And one of the great art brut artists that you have in your show is Joaquim Gironella, one of the early art brut artists that Dubuffet becomes fascinated in. He carved things out of cork. And in fact, in Dubuffet's entry on, you know, the biography of Gironella, he talks at first about how he encountered Gironella's work through his business connections, that he goes to someone that's involved in wine selling, and he's in an office with this businessman that produces or that sells cork. And then he sees on the wall Gironella's sculptures. So there's that interesting biographical connection between Dubuffet's former life in commerce, in the world of business, and then his attempt to separate himself from that and find this kind of, you know, utopian realm of art produced outside of the market. But yeah, I was so happy to see you including Gironella, one of my favorite art brut artists. So.
Sarah Wilson in the chat says that she's perfectly convinced Dubuffet would never have heard of outsider art, which yeah, seems perhaps quite likely. Can I just ask you guys, if you're willing, I've got one that's directed both to Hal and Kent, and I maybe we could ask that from Matthew Bowman. And he writes, I was wondering about the place of Dubuffet in relation to art brut, the material thinking of tel quel, and later in deconstruction. Demiche seems to largely marginalize the art brut side, despite the Robinson Crusoe reference, recoding the primal in Dubuffet as a complex and phenomenological structure of ground that would be later revised by Derrida on Van Gogh. I was wondering if something is lost or gained in that reading of Dubuffet by Demiche.
Great question. And Kent has worked more on the Demiche literature than I have. I think that's fair. It never really occurred to me because I find the Demiche reading of Dubuffet so charismatic. Here's a young intellectual in Paris, a student of Merleau-Ponty, who really wants to develop his phenomenology in relation to a practice that also seems to develop it. And this idea, I mean, this is the idea of art brut that I find most persuasive. And it's, in a way, the last version of art brut, which is steeped in his own practice, Dubuffet, that Dubuffet seeks, especially when the work becomes more material and more abstract, a wild primal state of perception. He doesn't seem to need to nominate or ex-nominate anything. He wants to find it in his practice. And this is really what Demiche develops in relation to that work as a young art historian. So it never occurred to me, given that's informed my understanding of Dubuffet so much, that any interpretation cuts out other interpretations, other accounts. But I think that that's true. It needs its own ground, and that ground displaces alternative grounds. But I'd like to hear Ken on the subject.
Oh, it's a tough question. Matthew, I think you are the Dubuffet expert. But I think it is central to, how you have this coda to the Dubuffet chapter, which is the brut as operation. And I think that the materiality of art brut and the strange things and that fall outside of normal art materials, and the operation of making art brut art is something that the Dubuffet was interested, which undid categories, which was part of his ex-nomination strategy. And I think it was a challenge to language. I think it was a challenge to, we know how to write about a sculpture by Polykleitos, but we don't know how to write about a work that's made out of breadcrumbs or cork or eggshells in the case of Francis Poulenc. So I think, there's that aspect of Dubuffet that is very, very Merleau-Pontian, which is about experience the work in a kind of raw state of perception. But I also think that he was so enamored with these strange materials that were used to create art brut and the way that they challenged us with our descriptions. They challenged art history. They challenged art criticism. They challenged language. So I do like your coda as brut as an ongoing operation, which decategorizes, which ex-nominates. I think that was part of Dubuffet's long-standing interest in in art brut.
Can I ask a question? We're going to need to wrap up in a minute, but a couple of people have asked questions in relation to COVID, which in a way is predictable, but is really a question that I've been asking myself. So I'd kind of love to pose it to the two of you, because this show was originally meant to open in September, and we've been working on it for some years prior to that, and then it was meant to open about 2 weeks ago, and obviously that hasn't happened. And each time I've been kind of questioning myself about what would Dubuffet and indeed other artists who might speak to positive barbarism, what would they think of it? What would they make of it? What does it mean to look at their work after everything that we've just been through this past year? Laura Holmes has written a similar question that says, it's clear that these artists all saw some kind of new renaissance in art after the trauma of war and the return to more primitive forms of working to establish a new foundation for culture, which is fascinating. Do you think that this could be paralleled now with COVID and the pandemic? So Hal, maybe I'll start with you, because I'm aware, you've been giving lots of talks and promotional activity around this book. There's a lot of excitement around it. And you must have been thinking about, what does this mean? What do these artists mean in this context?
I actually haven't thought much about it, but it's a great prompt. Again, if we can believe that art brut artists or some art brut artists don't work towards an audience, I've often thought, through the quarantine, of all that work in museums, that it no longer is there, or is not there now for us. And what does that do to our sense of the purpose of art, the purpose of us? And there might be a way in which not all these artists, but certainly the engagement of the art brut provides a way to begin to think about a time before us, after us, time when when we are perhaps not so centered. I mean, this is where the figures in my book are all across the spectrum. Some really do want to do all they can to rescue the human. I think this is a wonderful imperative in Jorn and Paolozzi. But there are others, I think Paolozzi or Jorn and Oldenburg, the others are a little bit more intrigued maybe with this kind of sublime of the end. There's a way in which, say, prehistory and Bataille connects with post-history. The beginning of man, the end of man. And that, that might be there in Dubuffet and Paolozzi as well. And there's a little bit of a kind of nasty sublime there, I think. Mm. And I think we should not thrill to images of our own destruction. I mean, as a young militant anti-humanist, it horrifies me to say, but I wonder if the project now, a la Oldenburg, this is one of his great lines, is to make hostile objects human again. I don't know.
I think we should end there. That was pretty nice. Hal, I would just say that, Dubuffet would not want us to experience art via Zoom. He would say, go see the show. He would be frustrated with that. At the same time, there was something about his Art Brut project that was kind of, peekaboo or hide and go seek, where, when his collection was at Osorio's estate in Long Island, he wanted people to see it. He wanted it to be on display, but he didn't want a major show of Art Brut in New York City at a gallery. He wanted people to make the trek. He wanted people to discover it on their own in his kind of little, I don't know what it was. He thought of Osorio's house as kind of a little cloister for Art Brut. And there was kind of that, it was hidden, but then it was there to be discovered. But that had to be done in person. So I think Dubuffet would say that we need to wait it out and then go see the art, go see your exhibition in person.
Thanks, Kent. Thanks, Hal. I mean, that seems like a great place to come to an end. And thanks, Eleanor, as well, for scooping up that set of questions that we're interested in exactly that issue so neatly at the end. That was fantastic, guys. Thank you so much for doing that. Thank you all to all three of you. Thanks for the audience as well, and have a good night.
Thank you, David.